When both engines died at 9,000 meters, the F-22 pilots monitoring the emergency heard a kid's call sign from the doomed airliner. They couldn't believe it. That legendary call sign belonged to a 12-year-old girl sitting in seat 14C. What happened next shocked the entire aviation world forever. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the departure gate at Denver International Airport as passengers filed onto Flight 847 bound for Seattle. Among them walked a slender 12-year-old girl with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie. A purple backpack hung from her shoulders, decorated with patches from national parks. To every adult who passed her, she appeared to be just another unaccompanied minor traveling alone. The gate agent had personally escorted her aboard. "Now sweetie, you've got seat 14C, that's a window seat. The flight attendants will check on you throughout the flight, okay?" The girl had smiled politely, hefting her backpack into the overhead compartment before sliding into her seat and pulling out a tablet loaded with homework assignments. The gate agent nodded approvingly and departed. As the aircraft filled, the flight attendants made their routine checks. Patricia, with 20 years of experience, stopped at row 14. "Hi there, I'm Patricia and I'll be taking care of you today. What's your name, honey?" The girl looked up. "I'm Emma, ma'am. I'm heading to Seattle to visit my grandmother for 2 weeks." Patricia smiled warmly. "Well, Emma, that sounds wonderful. If you need anything, just press this call button, okay?" Emma thanked her politely, and Patricia moved on. The businessman in 14B settled into his seat, noting her schoolbooks with benign disinterest before opening his laptop. The elderly couple across the aisle smiled at Emma, then returned to their preparations. What none of these passengers knew was that Emma carried something far more significant than homework. Tucked in her backpack was a small wooden plaque bearing a call sign that held legendary status in military aviation circles. The call sign was Phoenix, representing 4 generations of distinguished military aviators. Emma's great-grandfather had earned it flying P-51 Mustangs over Europe, her grandfather through Vietnam in F-4 Phantoms, and her mother flying F-16s as an instructor pilot. Emma had earned the right to carry the Phoenix call sign through extraordinary courage 2 years earlier. At age 10, she had been at an airshow when a vintage aircraft experienced catastrophic failure. While adults panicked, Emma grabbed a radio and talked an injured backup pilot through emergency procedures that saved an unconscious aviator's life. The backup pilot, partially blinded and disoriented, had followed steady instructions from a 10-year-old girl who spoke with the precision of a veteran combat controller. The military aviation community had been stunned. A formal ceremony attended by Air Force generals and Navy admirals presented Emma with the Phoenix call sign and honorary recognition. Fighter pilots who would never show weakness had lined up to shake her hand and tell her she honored the call sign. From that day forward, Emma was Phoenix, and every military aviator who heard that call sign knew what it represented. But sitting in seat 14C, surrounded by passengers who saw only a young girl with a backpack, Emma appeared to be nothing more than another child on another routine flight. She worked on her summer reading assignment and occasionally glanced out the window as the Boeing 737 climbed toward cruising altitude. The flight attendants completed their safety demonstration, and the captain announced they would be cruising at 9,000 meters with an estimated flight time of 2 hours and 45 minutes. The ascent was smooth and unremarkable. Patricia brought Emma extra cookies with a conspiratorial wink. The businessman was deep in his spreadsheets. The elderly couple began a quiet card game. Everything about Flight 847 suggested another routine day in commercial aviation. At 9,000 meters, the first engine failed without warning. The sudden loss of power sent a shuddering vibration through the aircraft. In the cockpit, Captain James Morrison felt his hands move automatically toward the engine controls. Engine number 1 showed complete failure, 0 thrust, 0 fuel flow. First Officer Sarah Chen was already running through the emergency checklist. Morrison initiated the restart procedure, monitoring instruments with intense focus. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then the second engine failed with a sickening lurch that every passenger felt. The vibration was followed by eerie smoothness as both engines went silent, leaving the aircraft gliding at 9,000 meters with nothing but gravity keeping it aloft. The cockpit erupted into controlled chaos as both pilots worked through emergency procedures. Morrison declared a mayday. "Mayday, mayday, mayday, this is United Flight 847, we have dual engine failure at flight level 300, approximately 100 nautical miles northeast of Denver, zero thrust, requesting immediate emergency assistance." Chen calculated their glide ratio, running numbers that would determine their survival time. A Boeing 737 at 9,000 meters with both engines dead could glide for approximately 15 to 20 minutes, covering 150 to 200 kilometers before reaching ground level. But they were over mountainous terrain. Morrison pulled up terrain maps, searching for landing sites, while Chen continued restart attempts that failed repeatedly. He realized they might have to attempt an unpowered landing. In the passenger cabin, the sudden silence created barely controlled panic. Veteran travelers recognized this was serious, their nervous glances toward flight attendants finding only carefully maintained composure. The crew had received emergency notification and moved through the cabin preparing passengers for emergency landing while projecting confident calm. Patricia moved automatically toward row 14 to check on the unaccompanied minor. Emma sat quietly in her window seat, her tablet now set aside, her eyes focused on the view outside where the mountain stretched endlessly below them and the unusual silence of the engines created an eerie quality to the flight that everyone aboard could feel. Patricia knelt in the aisle beside 14C, placing a gentle hand on Emma's shoulder with what she hoped was a reassuring smile. "Emma, honey, we're experiencing some technical difficulties, but the pilots are handling everything and we're going to be just fine. I need you to listen carefully to any instructions we give you, okay?" Emma turned to look at the flight attendant, and Patricia was surprised to see not fear in the young girl's eyes but something else entirely, a kind of focused assessment that seemed oddly mature for a 12-year-old. "Both engines failed," Emma said quietly, stating it as fact rather than question, and Patricia felt her rehearsed reassurances catch in her throat because yes, that was exactly what had happened, but how did this child know that? Before Patricia could respond, the aircraft's public address system crackled to life with Captain Morrison's voice, carefully controlled but carrying an undercurrent of urgency that made every passenger hold their breath. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We have experienced a dual-engine failure and are currently gliding while we work to restart the engines. We have declared an emergency and are coordinating with air traffic control for the nearest suitable landing site. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for possible emergency landing procedures. Passengers, please remain calm, follow all crew instructions, and review the safety card in your seat pocket." The announcement triggered exactly the response Morrison had feared, a wave of gasps and suppressed screams and frantic movements as passengers reached for phones to send final messages to loved ones or gripped armrests with white-knuckled terror or began crying openly as the reality of their situation crashed over them like a cold wave. Miles away and thousands of feet above the crippled airliner, two F-22 Raptor stealth fighters from the 27th Fighter Squadron were conducting routine patrol operations in the restricted airspace over Colorado. Major Alex Rodriguez and Captain Jennifer Viper Martinez had been flying a standard combat air patrol pattern, their advanced sensors monitoring the skies with the kind of casual efficiency that came from hundreds of hours in the cockpit of the most sophisticated fighter aircraft ever built. When the emergency declaration from Flight 847 came across the military coordination frequency, both pilots immediately shifted their attention to the unfolding crisis, their training kicking in as they processed the information and began coordinating with air traffic control to provide whatever assistance might be possible. Dual-engine failures at 30,000 feet were exceptionally rare in modern aviation, the kind of catastrophic emergency that made news headlines and triggered major investigations, and both pilots understood the gravity of what was happening aboard that civilian aircraft. Rodriguez checked his tactical display, pulling up flight information on United 847 and noting its current position, altitude, and rate of descent. "Control, Raptor 11, we have the emergency aircraft on our displays, requesting permission to intercept and provide visual assessment of the situation. The controller's response came back immediately, authorization granted, and Rodriguez smoothly banked his F-22 toward the coordinates of the gliding airliner while Martinez followed in tactical formation, both fighters accelerating to intercept the civilian aircraft that was descending inexorably toward the mountains below. As they closed the distance, Rodriguez noticed something unusual in the passenger manifest data that had been uploaded to their systems as part of the emergency response protocol, information that military aircraft could access during crisis situations to aid in coordination and response planning. The manifest showed 147 passengers and 6 crew members, standard information, but there was a notation attached to one passenger entry that made Rodriguez do a double take and immediately key his radio to his wingman. "Viper, are you seeing what I'm seeing on the manifest? Passenger in seat 14C is listed with a call sign designation in the military database." Martinez pulled up the same information on her display, her eyes widening behind her visor as she read the notation that should have been impossible. "Phoenix," she breathed over the radio, her voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and awe. "Rodriguez, that's the Phoenix call sign. 4-generation legacy, that airshow saved 2 years ago, every pilot in every service knows that story. But the manifest says this passenger is 12 years old. This has to be some kind of database error." Rodriguez felt a chill run down his spine despite the comfortable temperature in his pressurized cockpit. He had been at a military aviation conference 18 months earlier where the Phoenix legacy had been discussed during a presentation on courage under pressure and maintaining composure during emergencies. He had seen the video footage of that airshow incident, had listened to the audio recording of a 10-year-old girl calmly directing an injured pilot through emergency procedures with the precision of a trained combat controller, had heard the testimony from Air Force generals who stated unequivocally that Emma Phoenix had saved a pilot's life through sheer competence and inherited expertise. The idea that this legendary call sign was aboard a powerless aircraft currently gliding toward potential catastrophe while his F-22 raced to intercept filled him with a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't quite name. "Control, Raptor 1-1, can you confirm the identity of passenger Phoenix aboard United 847? We need verification that this is not a database error." The second stretched out while the controller checked and double-checked the information, cross-referencing multiple databases and passenger records before coming back with a response that made both F-22 pilots exchange glances across the distance between their aircraft. "Raptor 1-1, confirmation is positive, passenger Emma Phoenix, age 12, unaccompanied minor en route to Seattle, call sign verified through military family database and honorary recognition records. Be advised, this is an actual Phoenix legacy call sign holder aboard that aircraft." Rodriguez felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that this emergency had just become something more than a routine intercept and assist operation, that somewhere aboard that gliding airliner was a child who carried a call sign that commanded respect from the most elite warriors in the military aviation community. The F-22s closed to visual range with Flight 847, and both pilots could see the civilian airliner clearly against the bright sky, its wings level and steady despite the absence of engine thrust, the pilots aboard clearly managing their glide with professional skill. Rodriguez maneuvered his fighter into a position off the airliner's right wing, close enough to make visual assessment of the engines while maintaining safe separation, and what he saw confirmed the worst-case scenario. Both engine cowlings showed no signs of rotation, no heat shimmer from exhaust, no indication of any internal activity whatsoever, just dead metal hanging beneath the wings of an aircraft that was descending at approximately 1,500 feet per minute toward terrain that offered few safe landing options. He keyed his radio to the emergency frequency that Flight 847 would be monitoring. "United 847, this is Raptor 1-1, United States Air Force. We are positioned off your right wing and have visual confirmation of dual engine failure. We are coordinating with emergency services and will escort you to best available landing site." In the cockpit of the crippled airliner, Captain Morrison felt a surge of grim gratitude at having military support, even though he knew there was little the fighters could actually do to solve his immediate problem of flying a glider that used to be a commercial airliner. He acknowledged the F-22's transmission professionally, then returned his attention to the desperate task of finding somewhere, anywhere, to put down an aircraft that was rapidly running out of altitude and options. Chen had identified 3 possible landing sites within their glide range, none of them ideal: a small regional airport with a short runway that would make stopping the aircraft extremely difficult, a stretch of relatively flat highway that was probably too narrow and cluttered with vehicles to be safely usable, and a dry lake bed that looked promising on the charts but had unknown surface conditions that could cause the aircraft to break apart on touchdown. Back in the cabin, Emma unbuckled her seatbelt despite the ongoing emergency preparations, a violation of every safety protocol that would normally have brought immediate flight attendant intervention, but the crew was too busy preparing other passengers to notice one child moving in the confusion. She reached up to the overhead compartment, retrieved her purple backpack, and pulled out a small aviation radio that she had packed among her belongings, a compact civilian band transceiver that her mother had given her for emergencies with explicit instructions that it was never to be used casually but only in situations where her knowledge might make a difference. Emma had promised to follow that guidance, and as she looked out the window at the mountains below and felt the unnaturally smooth descent of an aircraft without engine power, she knew this qualified as exactly the kind of situation her mother had described. She turned on the radio, tuned it to the emergency frequency that she knew commercial aircraft monitored, and pressed the transmit button with hands that were steady despite her racing heartbeat. United 847 flight crew, this is passenger Phoenix in seat 14C. I have relevant emergency experience and inherited tactical aviation knowledge. I am monitoring this frequency if you need assistance with emergency procedures or coordination with military escort. The transmission was brief, professional, delivered in a young voice that nevertheless carried complete confidence and clarity, and it caused an immediate reaction in multiple cockpits simultaneously. In Flight 847's cockpit, Morrison and Chen exchanged shocked glances, Morrison's hand frozen on the radio controls as his brain processed what he had just heard. A passenger, identifying as Phoenix, offering assistance with emergency procedures, and that voice had definitely belonged to a child. In the F-22's flying escort, Rodriguez and Martinez heard the transmission and felt their earlier suspicions confirmed in the most dramatic way possible. Rodriguez immediately keyed his military frequency. Control, Raptor 1-1, we have voice confirmation that Phoenix is active and has made contact with the emergency aircraft crew on civilian emergency frequency. Recommend coordination protocols for tactical aviation expertise input if the crew chooses to utilize this resource. The controller's response came back with barely controlled astonishment, because even hardened professionals who dealt with emergencies daily were unprepared for the reality of a 12-year-old girl with a legendary call sign actively participating in managing a catastrophic aviation emergency. Morrison made a split-second decision based on years of experience that had taught him to use every resource available during emergencies, even resources that seemed impossible or unlikely. He keyed his radio to respond to the passenger who had just identified herself with a military call sign that he vaguely recognized from some article he had read about military aviation families. Phoenix, this is United 847 Captain, confirm you have emergency aviation expertise? We are currently gliding with zero thrust from both engines, all restart attempts unsuccessful, descending through 28,000 feet with limited landing options available. Emma's response came back immediately, her young voice somehow conveying both respect for his authority as captain and confidence in her own capabilities. Captain, I have 4 generations of military aviation family knowledge and personal recognition for emergency procedures management. I can assist with calculations for glide optimization and coordination with military escort for maximum distance extension to reach best available landing site. Chen pulled up the passenger manifest on her cockpit display, found seat 14C, and felt her heart skip when she saw the notation about the Phoenix call sign and the brief description of the airshow incident that had earned this 12-year-old child her place in military aviation history. She looked at Morrison with an expression that mixed professional skepticism with desperate hope, because they were running out of altitude and options, and if this child actually possessed the knowledge she claimed to have, then refusing that help would be foolish pride rather than sound judgment. Morrison nodded once, firmly, making the command decision to accept assistance from a source he would never have imagined in any scenario his training had prepared him for. Phoenix, United 847 Captain, we accept your assistance. Please coordinate with our escorts and provide recommendations for optimal glide management." Emma felt the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders, the same feeling she had experienced at that airshow 2 years ago when adult lives had depended on knowledge passed down through generations of Phoenix aviators. She took a deep breath, centered herself with the mental discipline her mother had taught her, and began applying everything she had learned from a lifetime of absorbing aviation expertise the way other children absorbed video games and social media. She keyed her radio again, speaking to both the airliner's crew and the F-22 pilots who were monitoring the emergency frequency. "All aircraft, Phoenix has recommendations for maximum glide extension to reach the dry lake bed southeast of current position. Recommend airspeed reduction to best glide speed for this aircraft type, which should be approximately 190 knots, slight increase in angle of attack to optimize lift-to-drag ratio, minimal use of flight control surfaces to reduce parasitic drag." Rodriguez, listening from his F-22, felt a surge of professional respect that transcended the impossibility of receiving tactical aviation advice from a 12-year-old child, because every word she had just spoken was correct, the kind of precise knowledge that came from deep understanding of aircraft performance and emergency procedures. He keyed his own radio to add military support to her recommendations. United 847, Raptor 11 confirms Phoenix recommendations are sound. "We have calculated the dry lake bed as best available option. We are coordinating with emergency services to have rescue assets staged at that location. Estimate you have approximately 12 minutes to cover the distance at current descent rate." In Flight 847's cockpit, Morrison adjusted his airspeed to match the recommendation, feeling the aircraft's glide performance improve marginally as he found the sweet spot where lift and drag balanced for maximum horizontal distance covered per foot of altitude lost. Chen was working frantically with navigation systems to plot the course to the dry lake bed, calculating that they would arrive with perhaps 500 feet of altitude remaining if they maintained current performance, enough to set up a proper approach but leaving zero margin for error. She keyed the intercom to the cabin crew. "Flight attendants, prepare passengers for emergency landing in approximately 10 minutes, we will be landing on a dry lake bed, surface conditions unknown, expect rough touchdown and possible aircraft damage, ensure all passengers are in brace positions and emergency exits are prepared." Patricia and her fellow flight attendants moved through the cabin with impressive professionalism despite their own fear, securing loose items, reviewing emergency procedures with passengers who were too terrified to process much of what they were being told, and preparing themselves mentally for whatever would come when this aircraft touched down on unprepared terrain far from any airport. Patricia noticed that Emma had moved from her seat and was standing in the aisle with a small radio in her hands, speaking into it with a calm authority that seemed completely at odds with her age and appearance, and for a moment, the flight attendant wondered if stress was causing her to hallucinate because surely this child was not actually coordinating emergency procedures with the flight crew and military escorts. Emma continued providing guidance, her inherited knowledge flowing naturally as she considered factors that experienced pilots understood but might not prioritize correctly under the stress of an emergency. "Captain, recommend maximum use of remaining altitude to position for straight-in approach to the lake bed rather than attempting any circling or maneuvering that would waste energy. The F-22 escorts can provide precise guidance for the approach path using their advanced navigation systems to ensure you align with the longest and most favorable section of the landing surface." Morrison acknowledged, recognizing the wisdom in her suggestion, and Rodriguez immediately coordinated the approach guidance, his F-22's sophisticated systems calculating the optimal flight path that would bring the gliding airliner to the dry lake bed with maximum remaining energy for maneuvering during the final approach. The elderly couple in row 13 had been listening to Emma's radio transmissions with growing astonishment, their card game completely forgotten as they realized the quiet child they had smiled at during boarding was somehow helping to save everyone aboard the aircraft. The businessman in 14B had closed his laptop and was staring at Emma with an expression that mixed shock, confusion, and dawning comprehension that his assumptions about the young passenger beside him had been catastrophically wrong. Other passengers nearby had begun to notice as well, word spreading through the cabin in whispered conversations that somehow a child no older than their own sons and daughters, was on the radio talking to the pilots and the military fighters like she had been doing this her entire life. The minutes ticked past with agonizing slowness as Flight 847 descended steadily toward the lake bed that appeared as a pale oval on the horizon, growing larger with each passing second as the aircraft glided closer to its emergency landing site. Emma continued monitoring the approach, offering occasional suggestions that demonstrated her understanding of not just basic aviation but the subtle complexities of energy management and aircraft performance that separated competent flying from exceptional flying. She recommended minor adjustments to heading that would account for wind drift, suggested when to deploy landing gear to balance the drag penalty against the need for aerodynamic efficiency, and coordinated with the F-22 escorts to ensure rescue assets were properly positioned for immediate response once the aircraft landed. Rodriguez had pulled his fighter into a position where he could watch the airliner's approach to the lake bed, his heart pounding despite his thousands of hours of combat flying experience, because he had seen enough aviation accidents to know how many things could go catastrophically wrong during an unpowered landing on unprepared terrain. Martinez flew her F-22 at a higher altitude, coordinating with ground rescue teams and providing real-time updates on the approaching aircraft's position and status. Both pilots found themselves silently rooting for a child they had never met, a 12-year-old girl who carried a call sign that represented everything they respected about military aviation heritage and personal courage under pressure. At 2,000 feet above the lake bed, Morrison deployed the landing gear, feeling the aircraft shudder as the drag increased and the descent rate steepened, sacrificing some of their precious remaining glide distance in exchange for being configured for landing when they reached the surface. Chen armed the emergency slides and verified that all emergency systems were ready, her hands moving through familiar checklists with the automatic precision of years of training while her mind raced with possibilities of what might happen when they touched down. Emma keyed her radio one final time as the lake bed rushed up to meet them, the pale surface filling the windows and appearing far rougher and more uneven than it had looked from altitude. "Captain, remember to flare gently and touch down with minimum vertical speed. The surface may be softer than expected and you want to avoid nose gear collapse, maintain directional control throughout the rollout and be prepared for emergency evacuation if the aircraft structure is compromised." The final seconds of the approach seemed to stretch into eternity as Morrison pulled back on the controls to flare the aircraft, trading forward momentum for lift to reduce their descent rate to something survivable, holding the airliner just above the surface as the airspeed bled off and gravity began to win its inevitable victory. The main landing gear contacted the lake bed with a jarring impact that sent vibrations through the entire aircraft structure, harder than any normal landing but not catastrophic, and Morrison immediately began fighting to keep the wings level and the nose straight as the unprepared surface grabbed at the wheels with uneven friction. The nose gear slammed down with a sharp crack that suggested possible damage, but the gear held, and the aircraft rolled across the lake bed trailing plumes of dust and sand, slowing gradually as the drag of the soft surface worked better than any brakes to reduce their speed. Flight 847 rolled to a complete stop roughly 800 meters from the initial touchdown point, sitting at a slight angle on the uneven surface but intact, all major structural components still functional, and most critically, with no fire or immediate danger to the 147 passengers and 6 crew members who had just survived a catastrophic emergency through a combination of professional skill, military coordination, and the inherited knowledge of a 12-year-old girl. Carrying a legendary call sign. Morrison sat in his seat for 3 heartbeats, his hands still gripping the controls, processing the fact that they were down, they were safe, they had accomplished something that should have been impossible. Then he keyed the cabin intercom with a voice that shook with emotion he didn't try to hide. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are on the ground, emergency evacuation procedures will begin immediately, please follow all crew instructions and exit the aircraft as quickly and safely as possible." The evacuation was textbook perfect, the training that flight attendants underwent repeatedly proving its worth as passengers streamed down the emergency slides and moved away from the aircraft across the dusty surface of the lake bed. Patricia found Emma as soon as she cleared the aircraft herself, the flight attendant's professional composure finally cracking as she wrapped the young girl in a fierce hug that mixed relief and gratitude and wonder at what this child had just accomplished. "You saved us," Patricia whispered, her voice choked with tears she couldn't control. "I don't understand how or why, but you saved every single person on this aircraft." Emma hugged her back, feeling the adrenaline beginning to fade and exhaustion settling into her bones, the weight of responsibility lifting now that everyone was safe and her job was done. The F-22 Raptors made several low passes over the landing site, Rodriguez and Martinez both wanting to verify visually that the emergency had concluded successfully, that the legendary Phoenix call sign holder and all the souls aboard that aircraft had survived the impossible situation that had unfolded at 9,000 meters. Rodriguez keyed his radio to the military frequency, his voice carrying an emotion that elite fighter pilots rarely allowed themselves to express. Control, Raptor 1-1, United 847 is safely on the ground, all passengers appear to have evacuated successfully, rescue assets are arriving on scene. Be advised, Phoenix performed magnificently, that call sign continues to honor its legacy in ways that exceed comprehension. Request permission to break formation and render honors. The controller, who had been following the entire emergency and had heard the transmissions from a 12-year-old girl who spoke like a seasoned combat aviator, granted the request without hesitation. Rodriguez and Martinez brought their F-22s around in a final pass over the lake bed, flying in close formation directly over the evacuated passengers and crew, close enough that the distinctive shape of the advanced stealth fighters was clearly visible against the sky. As they passed overhead, both pilots rolled their aircraft in the traditional salute, a gesture of respect normally reserved for fallen warriors or ceremonies honoring the most distinguished military achievements. The passengers and crew standing on the lake bed looked up at the display, many of them not understanding the significance but some recognizing it as something extraordinary, a tribute from elite fighters to someone among them who had earned their profound respect. Emma stood with Patricia's arms still around her shoulders, watching the F-22s complete their salute and streak away into the blue sky, and she felt tears finally beginning to form in her eyes as the full emotional weight of what had just happened began to settle onto her 12-year-old shoulders. She had carried the Phoenix call sign with pride and determination for 2 years, had studied and learned and absorbed everything her mother and grandfather and the entire aviation family legacy could teach her, but she had never imagined she would need to use that knowledge to save 147 people aboard a powerless aircraft descending through thin air above the mountains. Her mother had always told her that carrying the Phoenix call sign meant being ready to rise when circumstances required it, to find courage in moments of crisis, to honor the legacy through actions rather than words. Standing on that dry lake bed with everyone safe and alive around her, Emma understood in a way she never had before what it truly meant to carry a call sign that represented 4 generations of military aviation excellence. The rescue helicopters arrived minutes later, followed by emergency vehicles that had driven cross-country to reach the isolated landing site, and the scene transformed into organized chaos as medical teams assessed passengers for injuries and coordination began for transporting everyone to the nearest hospital for evaluation. Captain Morrison made his way through the crowd of evacuated passengers, scanning faces until he found the auburn-haired girl standing with the flight attendant, and when their eyes met, he saw a depth of understanding there that transcended age or experience. He approached Emma and extended his hand formally, the gesture of one professional to another, and spoke words that came from the deepest place of gratitude a captain could access. "Phoenix, I'm Captain Morrison, and I want to thank you personally for your assistance during this emergency. Your knowledge and guidance contributed directly to the survival of everyone aboard this aircraft, and I will ensure that fact is documented in my official report and communicated to every relevant authority in civilian and military aviation." Emma shook his hand with a grip that her grandfather had taught her, firm and confident, meeting the captain's eyes with the directness that military aviators expected from someone carrying a call sign of significance. "Captain, I'm honored to have been able to help, and you and your first officer deserve all credit for bringing this aircraft down safely under impossible conditions. The Phoenix legacy is about rising when needed, and I'm grateful I could honor my family by contributing to saving these lives." Morrison felt something catch in his throat at hearing those words from a child who should have been thinking about school and friends and normal 12-year-old concerns, not about honoring military aviation legacies through emergency procedure coordination during catastrophic failures at altitude. The news media arrived within hours, having caught wind of the dramatic emergency landing and the unusual involvement of military fighters in the rescue coordination, and the story that emerged over the following days and weeks captured international attention in ways that no one aboard Flight 847 could have anticipated. The combination of a dual-engine failure at cruising altitude, a powerless glide to an emergency landing on a dry lake bed, the presence of F-22 Raptor escorts, and most compellingly, the revelation that a 12-year-old girl carrying a legendary four-generation military call sign had actively participated in coordinating the emergency response created a narrative that resonated with people around the world. Emma Phoenix became famous overnight, her face appearing on news broadcasts and magazine covers, her story shared and reshared across social media by millions of people who found inspiration in the image of a quiet child with a purple backpack who possessed the kind of courage and competence that saved lives when everything went wrong at 9,000 meters. The military aviation community responded to the incident with a mixture of pride and reverence, recognizing that Emma had once again demonstrated the qualities that made the Phoenix call sign legendary across generations. Air Force generals issued official statements commending her actions and noting that her performance under pressure represented the very best traditions of military aviation heritage. Fighter pilot squadrons around the country held informal ceremonies honoring Phoenix, with experienced combat aviators expressing their respect for a 12-year-old girl who had faced an impossible situation and responded with the grace and skill of a veteran warrior. Rodriguez and Martinez were interviewed extensively about their role in the emergency, and both pilots spoke with undisguised admiration about listening to Phoenix coordinate the emergency procedures with a professionalism that matched or exceeded anything they had witnessed from trained military personnel. Emma's mother flew to meet her daughter as soon as the news reached her, arriving to find Emma surrounded by reporters and officials and grateful passengers who wanted to express their thanks to the child who had helped save them. The reunion was emotional and private despite the public attention, mother and daughter holding each other while 4 generations of Phoenix legacy settled around them like a tangible presence. Emma's mother had carried the call sign through combat and training in countless flights where lives depended on her skill, and she understood better than anyone what her daughter had experienced, the weight of responsibility and the crushing awareness that people would die if you failed to perform perfectly when circumstances demanded perfection. The formal investigation into the dual-engine failure revealed that a manufacturing defect in both engines had caused simultaneous catastrophic failures, a 1-in-a-million combination of circumstances that should have resulted in the loss of the aircraft and everyone aboard. The investigators' report specifically cited the coordinated efforts of the flight crew, the F-22 escort pilots, and passenger Emma Phoenix as contributing factors in the survival of all souls aboard, marking the first time in aviation history that a child passenger had been officially recognized in an accident investigation report for providing expert assistance during an emergency. The report's conclusion included a statement that the Phoenix call sign had once again lived up to its legendary status, rising from impossible circumstances to ensure survival and success when all conventional expectations suggested catastrophe. For Emma, life eventually returned to something approximating normal, though she would never again be just another kid on an airplane, never again be underestimated by adults who saw only age and appearance rather than capability and heritage. She completed her interrupted trip to visit her grandmother, who held her for a long time without speaking and then took her to a quiet place where photographs of 4 generations of Phoenix aviators hung on the wall, adding a new picture to the collection, Emma standing on the dry lake bed beside Captain Morrison, her young face serious and composed, her posture reflecting the confidence and competence that had saved 147 lives when engines failed at 9,000 meters. The F-22 pilots who had escorted Flight 847 during its emergency descent requested and received permission to visit Emma several months after the incident, wanting to meet in person the child whose voice they had heard coordinating emergency procedures with such impressive skill. The meeting took place at an Air Force base where Emma's mother was stationed, and when Rodriguez and Martinez walked into the room and saw the 12-year-old girl standing there in jeans and a t-shirt, they felt the cognitive dissonance that came from reconciling the image with the memory of that calm, professional voice on the emergency frequency. They shook her hand with the same formal respect they would show any distinguished aviator, and Rodriguez spoke words that he had thought carefully about for months. "Phoenix, Viper, and I wanted to tell you in person that flying escort during your emergency was one of the most profound experiences of our careers. Hearing your call sign, understanding what it represented, and then listening to you perform under pressure with such skill reminded us why we do what we do and what our profession stands for. You honor that call sign and your family legacy in ways that inspire all of us to be better aviators and better warriors." Emma thanked them with the same composure she had shown during the emergency, but later, when the formal meeting concluded and she stood with her mother watching the two F-22s launch for their return flight, she finally allowed herself to cry, the tears flowing not from fear or pain but from the overwhelming recognition that she was part of something larger than herself, a legacy that transcended age and rank and experience, a tradition of rising when needed and finding courage when everything seemed impossible. Her mother held her while she cried, understanding completely because she had stood in similar moments throughout her own career, realizing what it meant to carry the Phoenix call sign and the responsibility that came with honoring 4 generations of aviation excellence. The passengers from Flight 847 stayed in touch with Emma in the years that followed, many of them sending letters and messages expressing gratitude that never seemed adequate to convey what they felt about the child who had helped save their lives. Patricia, the flight attendant, visited several times, bringing cookies and sharing updates about her own life and career, the two of them having formed a bond during those desperate minutes when a powerless aircraft glided toward the mountains and a 12-year-old girl with a legendary call sign had demonstrated that courage and competence could transcend any limitation of age or experience. The businessman from seat 14B wrote Emma a letter apologizing for underestimating her, for seeing only a child with a tablet rather than recognizing the depth and significance that existed beneath surface appearances, and thanking her for the lesson in humility and the reminder that extraordinary capability could exist in unexpected packages. Years later, when Emma would eventually become old enough to pursue her own military aviation career, she would look back on that day at 9,000 meters as the moment when she truly understood what the Phoenix call sign represented, not just family heritage or honorary recognition but the living embodiment of rising when circumstances required it, of finding expertise and courage when lives depended on perfect performance under impossible pressure. The dual-engine failure at cruising altitude had taken everything safe and normal and replaced it with catastrophe, but it had also revealed what happened when legendary call signs, inherited knowledge, and personal courage came together in the thin air above the mountains. The F-22 pilots who had heard a kid's call sign and rendered honors to a 12-year-old girl would carry their own memories of that day throughout their careers, telling the story to younger pilots as an example of what their profession truly meant when stripped of all the technology and weapons and tactics down to its essential core of skill, meeting emergency with competence that transcended age or conventional expectation. The story would be told and retold in ready rooms and training facilities, becoming part of military aviation lore, the day when Phoenix rose again at 9,000 meters and proved that some legacies were earned not through age or rank but through the courage to act when action was required and the knowledge to succeed when failure seemed certain. Emma Phoenix would grow and change and eventually pursue her own distinguished career, but she would never forget standing in the aisle of a powerless aircraft with a small radio in her hands, speaking calmly to professionals who trusted her despite every reason to doubt, coordinating an emergency response that saved 147 lives because 4 generations of aviators had passed down knowledge and courage and the fundamental understanding that the Phoenix call sign meant rising from impossible circumstances no matter what form those circumstances took. At 9,000 meters, when the engines failed and death seemed certain, a kid with a legendary call sign had shown the world what it truly meant to honor a legacy through actions that matched the heritage of warriors who had carried that call sign through 4 generations of military aviation excellence. The F-22s had heard her voice, recognized her call sign, and witnessed her rise when rising was required, and in doing so, they had confirmed what every Phoenix aviator had always known, that courage and competence recognized no limits of age when legacy and circumstance met in moments that demanded the very best that human capability could offer.